My darling Leo, I see you. Tonight I want to explain something that has very likely happened to you at least once, and that I do not think anybody has ever properly explained, which is why somebody who showed no particular interest while you were reaching toward them, suddenly, quietly, reappears, precisely once you have genuinely stopped. Astrology forecast for tonight, my darling. Why certain people return when you finally stop chasing them, and I want to be honest with you before anything else. I am not promising you a reunion tonight, and I am not telling you that stopping is a clever strategy for making somebody come back. If it were a strategy, it would not actually work, because the entire mechanism I am about to explain depends on you genuinely, actually stopping, not performing a stopping designed to produce a result. I am Madame Aurora, 35 years studying the stars from my office in Manhattan, and let me give you the real astronomy first, because it is considerably more elegant than any relationship advice I could invent on my own. Gravity, my darling, does not work through motion toward an object. It works through mass. The sun holds the entire solar system in orbit without moving a single inch toward any of the planets circling it. It simply is, fully, completely, at the center, and that completeness alone is what every other body in the system responds to. Your own ruling planet is the clearest possible illustration of exactly the principle I am describing to you tonight. The sun has never once chased a planet. It has never needed to. Its own mass was always sufficient. When you chase somebody, my darling, you are doing the opposite of what your own ruling body actually does. You are moving toward them, repeatedly, visibly, and in doing so, you are demonstrating, plainly, that your own gravitational center currently requires their motion in order to feel complete. My darling, that demonstration is precisely what so often produces resistance rather than attraction. And when you finally, genuinely stop, you are not performing indifference. You are simply returning to your own full mass, your own completeness, and whatever was ever going to be drawn to that mass, on its own, without your having to move an inch toward it, is now, finally, free to actually respond to it. Let me show you the card I have chosen for you tonight, because it tells you exactly what to actually do with a return, once it arrives. The card is Temperance. An angel stands with one foot resting on solid ground, and one foot submerged in a flowing stream, pouring liquid from one cup into another, held in each hand. The liquid, in most traditional renderings, arcs between the two cups in a way that does not quite obey the ordinary pull of gravity, suspended, briefly, in careful, deliberate motion. Everybody reads this card the same way, and I do not think the popular reading is wrong. Balance, patience, the careful blending of two things that must not be rushed together too quickly. That is exactly what the card means. But look at the angel's feet, my darling, because it is the detail almost nobody actually mentions. One on land, one in water, not committed fully to either element, not standing entirely in the safety of solid ground, and not submerged entirely in the water either. The angel occupies both, simultaneously, deliberately, without being swept away by either one. That is the whole of tonight's lesson, my darling. If somebody from your past does return, once you have genuinely stopped chasing, you are not required to decide, immediately, whether to dive fully back into the water or retreat entirely onto dry land. You are permitted to stand exactly where this angel stands, 1 foot in what was, 1 foot in what currently is, pouring carefully, testing the mixture before you commit to drinking any of it fully. Now let me give you 3 real reasons this actually happens, my darling, because the astronomy explains the mechanism, and I think you deserve the specific psychology underneath it as well. The first is a genuine, well-documented human response called reactance. My darling, when a person feels pursued, even gently, some part of the mind, entirely automatically, resists, precisely because being pursued can feel like having a choice quietly taken away. The moment the pursuit stops, that automatic resistance has nothing left to push against, and whatever genuine interest may have been sitting underneath it, obscured by the resistance itself, sometimes finally has room to surface. The second is that chasing, however lovingly intended, makes your own need considerably more visible than your own value. My darling, a person reaching, repeatedly, towards somebody who has not reached back is, without meaning to, broadcasting a specific message, that she requires this particular response in order to feel complete. And need, however understandable, is rarely what draws somebody toward another person. Completeness is. When you stop and your own life visibly, genuinely continues, full and undiminished by their absence, you are broadcasting an entirely different message, without ever having to send it directly. I want to name why this particular reason lands so specifically on your own sign, my darling. You are by nature magnetic when you are genuinely, fully yourself, radiant, without requiring anybody's specific attention in order to shine. The chasing, whenever it happens, is very often a departure from that natural state rather than an expression of it, a temporary eclipse of your own considerable light by the anxious need for a particular response. Stopping is not a performance for your sign. It is, quite literally, a return to your own actual, native setting. And the third, which is the gentlest and, I think, the most honest. Absence removes the pressure that was quietly telling the other person what to feel. My darling, a person being actively pursued very often reflexively declines, not because the answer is genuinely no, but because pursuit itself can feel like an implicit demand for an immediate response, and a reflexive no under pressure is not always the same as an honest, considered no. Once the pressure lifts, some people discover, privately, on their own timeline, that their actual feelings were never quite as settled as the reflexive answer suggested. Now let me speak to closure, my darling, because I want to correct a specific assumption you are very likely carrying into this reading. You may believe that a genuine return would finally give you the closure the original ending never provided. My darling, I want to be honest with you. It very often does not, and building your whole sense of peace around the hope that it will is a considerable risk to take with your own well-being. Closure, properly understood, is not something another person delivers to you. It is something you construct, yourself, from whatever information you actually have, regardless of whether more information ever arrives. If a return happens, it may add genuine clarity. It may also simply reopen a question you had, in fact, already answered privately, and I would ask you to build your own peace on ground that does not depend on whether this particular person ever walks back across it. I want to give you a practical way to actually build that ground, because a general instruction to construct your own closure can feel, without a method, considerably harder than it needs to be. Write, plainly, the account of what actually happened, as honestly as you can manage, including the parts that do not flatter either of you. Read it back to yourself once. That account, written and settled in your own words, is your closure, my darling, complete in itself, whether or not the other person ever confirms a single detail of it. Now let me speak to change dynamics, because a return, when it happens, very rarely restores the exact relationship that existed before. Time changes both people, my darling, considerably more than either of you may expect. And the person who returns is not actually the same person who left, any more than you are the same person who was once chasing her. The specific old dynamic, whatever shape it took, however comfortable or however painful, does not simply reactivate itself, unchanged, the moment contact resumes. A genuine reconnection, if this becomes one, has to be built freshly between two people who have both continued living in the meantime, rather than picked back up exactly where it was set down. Now let me speak to discernment, my darling, because this is the actual heart of tonight's whole reading, and I want to give you something considerably more useful than a general instruction to be careful. The mechanism I described at the start of tonight's reading explains why somebody returns. It says nothing at all about whether that person is actually good for you, and I do not want you confusing the two. Somebody who was genuinely unkind, dismissive, or unreliable while you were reaching toward her does not become kind, attentive, or reliable simply by returning once you stopped. The astronomy is neutral, my darling. It describes a mechanism of attraction, not a verdict on character, and a return produced by the exact same mechanism can belong equally to somebody genuinely worth reconsidering and somebody who was never actually good for you in the first place. I want to give you the actual test, because I think it is worth more than anything else I have said tonight. When this person returns, notice, honestly, whether the return comes with any real acknowledgement of whatever went wrong before, or whether it simply arrives as though the ending never happened at all, expecting to resume exactly where things left off. Notice whether her behavior in this new contact actually differs from the behavior that led you to stop chasing in the first place, or whether it is simply the same pattern, delivered now instead of before. A genuine, healthy reconnection carries evidence of change. A return that is simply the old pattern, reasserting itself once your absence became noticeable, is not a reconnection worth pursuing, whatever the astronomy explains about why it happened. I want to name one further, more serious distinction here, because I do not want tonight's reading to be gentle to the point of unhelpfulness. If the original relationship involved genuine harm, deception, or a pattern that frightened you rather than simply disappointed you, a return produced by exactly this same neutral gravitational mechanism deserves none of the careful, patient testing I am describing tonight. Some doors, my darling, are correctly, permanently closed, regardless of what brings somebody back to knock on them, and temperance's careful blending was never meant to apply to a situation your own safety required you to leave in the first place. Let me tell you about Marigold, because I think her story shows exactly how this mechanism and this discernment actually work together, in real, ordinary practice. Marigold was a Leo client of mine who came to me some years ago about a former partner she had spent nearly a year, on and off, trying to win back after he ended their relationship, calling, messaging, arranging apparent coincidences that were not actually coincidences, in a pattern that left her, by her own account, considerably more exhausted than hopeful by the time she finally, genuinely gave it up. She did not stop as a strategy, she told me plainly. She stopped because she had simply run out of whatever had been fueling the pursuit and had begun, slowly, rebuilding an actual life that did not orbit around waiting for him to change his mind. He reached out again, roughly 8 months into her genuine absence, and Marigold told me her first instinct had been a kind of vindicated relief, as though the return itself proved she had been right to want him back all along. She sat with the astronomy I have just given you and asked herself the actual test, honestly, before responding. What she found, examining his message and the following weeks of renewed contact carefully, was that nothing about his actual behavior had changed. The same inconsistency, the same reluctance to actually define what either of them wanted, the same pattern that had originally led to the ending, now simply delivered 8 months later, once her absence had made him curious enough to check. She decided, considerably more calmly than the earlier year of chasing would have allowed, not to reopen it. She told me, some months later, I think the old version of me would have taken the return itself as the whole answer. It felt so significant, after everything, that he had actually reached back. What I learned, sitting with it properly, was that the reaching back was never actually about me being right to want him. It was simply gravity, doing what gravity does. It did not mean he had become somebody worth wanting again. I asked her whether declining had been difficult, given how significant the return had initially felt. She said the initial message had been considerably harder to sit with than the actual decision, once she had done the honest work of comparing his behavior against what she had written down weeks earlier, on an ordinary day, before any of it was actually happening. She said, having it already written made the comparison almost mechanical. I did not have to trust my judgment in the emotional middle of the moment. I only had to read what I had already decided, calmly, and see whether the evidence matched it. If any of this has landed, my darling, tap that little like button below this video. It helps this reading find somebody else who is about to mistake a return itself for proof that the person returning is actually worth reopening the door for. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment, because I make readings like this one for every sign, and I would love for you to be here when the next one arrives. Leave me a comment, my darling, and tell me, in a single word or a short phrase, which of tonight's parts touched something real. Closure, change dynamics, discernment, or simply the mechanism itself. I read every single comment, truly, and a comment section full of women, each naming her own honest word, is a room full of people quietly discovering that a return is not, on its own, ever actually the answer they have been waiting for. Now let me give you the ritual, and it is built specifically around temperance's 2 feet, one on land, one in the water, so that if a return actually happens, you already have the exact posture ready rather than having to invent it in the moment. Find 20 minutes, sometime this week. A pale, watery blue candle if you like one, for the stream in tonight's card, and if you have none, my darling, it changes nothing, because the object was never the mechanism. Take a piece of paper and draw two simple shapes: land on one side, water on the other. On the land side, write what you already, genuinely know to be true about this person, based on real, accumulated evidence rather than hope. Their actual, demonstrated patterns, good and difficult both. On the water side, write what a genuine, healthy return would actually need to include in orter to be worth reconsidering. Specific behavior, specific acknowledgement, specific change, rather than a vague, general hope that things would somehow be different this time. Keep the page, my darling, whether or not this particular person ever actually returns. And if she, or he, does, take the page out again before you respond to anything, and check the actual contact against what you wrote, honestly, on an ordinary day, before any of it was actually happening. Now, my darling, let me give you the thing I have been building toward the whole of this hour. I want to return, one final time, to the sun itself, because I think it holds the actual answer to a fear I suspect has been sitting underneath tonight's whole reading, even if you have not said it aloud. You may be worried that stopping the chasing means you will simply never know, that genuine peace requires either the return itself or a certainty that it will never come, and that anything short of one of those two outcomes leaves you stranded, indefinitely, in an uncomfortable middle. My darling, the sun does not require a planet's continued orbit in order to remain the sun. It would go on being exactly, fully itself, radiant and complete, whether every planet in the solar system continued circling it or drifted off entirely, in some impossible scenario, toward another star altogether. Your own completeness was never actually contingent on this person's eventual return, whatever the astronomy explains about why a return sometimes happens. You built the return of your own energy, your own life, your own genuine mass, considerably before any of tonight's mechanism ever became relevant, and that building is the actual accomplishment here, my darling, regardless of what this specific person ultimately does or does not do. If they return, you now have Temperance's careful, unhurried posture and Marigold's honest test, ready to actually use. If they never do, you already have the considerably larger thing, your own full, undiminished self, which was never actually waiting on their motion in the first place. My darling, before I let you go, 3 small things. 1. If any part of this reading found you tonight, if you recognized your own year of chasing in Marigold's story, or your own hope for closure that a return might not actually provide, tap that like button. It helps this reading find somebody else who needs exactly this clarity tonight. 2. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because I make readings like this one for every sign, and I would love for you to be here when the next one arrives. 3. And this is the one I care about most. One word: closure, change dynamics, discernment, or the mechanism itself. And if this reading gave you something and you ever want to say thank you more directly, a super thanks is never expected and always felt, and it is a genuine part of how I keep making these readings as carefully as I make them. If you know another Leo who is still chasing somebody who has never once turned back toward her, send this to her tonight. You may not realize how much a single share matters. It is how this work finds the person who needs it. Thank you, my darling. This community has become something I genuinely did not expect when I began. Why certain people return when you finally stop chasing them. That is the title, and I want to close by telling you exactly what I mean by it, because it is not entirely what you thought when this hour began. It does not mean stopping is a clever technique for making somebody come back, and it does not mean a return, if it happens, is automatically worth welcoming back in. It means your own completeness was always the actual gravity at work, considerably more reliable and considerably more valuable than any single person's motion toward or away from you, and whatever this particular person eventually does, your own mass, fully restored, was always the real accomplishment underneath tonight's whole reading. Stand where temperance stands, my darling. 1 foot on solid ground, 1 foot in the water, if the moment actually arrives. And if it never does, know that you were never actually incomplete, waiting, in the meantime. You were simply, fully, radiantly yourself, the entire time. I am Madame Aurora from Manhattan, and I love you, my dear Leo. I will see you in the next reading.